What would you sacrifice to give your child a better life? Drop your city in the comments, and let's begin this unforgettable journey. On a quiet, bitter night in Ridgefield, Claire Monroe stepped into a world she never thought she'd be, part of a place where silence was currency and women were reduced to numbers and price tags. She sat alone near the back of the gilded ballroom, her coat still damp from the rain. Around her, everything shimmered chandeliers, polished marble, champagne glasses, but all she could think about was Ethan, her 6-year-old son, sleeping under a borrowed blanket, back at Mrs. Jenkins' apartment down the hall from theirs. They were months behind on rent. Claire had skipped dinners so Ethan could eat. There were nights she cried silently, pretending her headaches came from work, not hunger. This auction, it wasn't a choice. It was desperation dressed in silk. A man in a gray suit, too polished to be real, approached her with a clipboard and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Miss Monroe, just smile, walk slowly, and don't engage with anyone. They prefer mystery." She barely nodded, too numb to respond. The room grew quiet as the announcer's voice echoed, "Lot number 27, Claire Monroe." Her breath caught. Her legs nearly gave out. But she rose, stepped into the light. The stage was blinding. She heard nothing but the pounding of her heart and the whispers behind manicured hands. Men in tuxedos scanned her like appraisers, not for beauty, but for worth. A rare elegance, the host purred. A perfect candidate. She wanted to disappear. Then one voice cut through the murmurs. $1 million. The hall fell still. All heads turned toward the back, where a man in a dark navy suit sat motionless. Nathaniel Cross, a name only whispered in corporate circles, known for vanishing deals and untouchable power. No one had expected him to attend. No one dared to outbid him. "Sold," the host said, almost stunned. Claire stepped down from the stage, legs trembling beneath her borrowed heels. Her fate had just been signed and sealed with a number. Nathaniel approached with a gaze that gave away nothing. "Come," he said, "we need to discuss the terms." She followed him to a quiet lounge, tastefully decorated but cold. He handed her a thick envelope. "This is the agreement. I suggest you read carefully." Her fingers trembled as she opened it. Clause after clause blurred into one another until her eyes stopped cold. "You want me to carry your child and then leave." He nodded once. "That's the arrangement. You'll be compensated. After the child is born, our contract ends." Claire stood, her voice shaking. "That's not just an arrangement. That's a life, a child." Nathaniel's voice was low, firm. "You knew what this was. I didn't force you to come here." "No, you didn't," she snapped. "But don't pretend this is fair. You can't just buy motherhood like property." "I paid $1 million, he replied calmly. "This isn't a whim. You agreed." Claire looked down at the contract, then back to the storm inside her. And then she saw Ethan curled up under blankets, asking if Santa was still coming this year. With a breath that hurt her lungs, she signed. Nathaniel collected the document without a word. "Medical exams begin tomorrow. You'll be moved across the state after that. Get some rest." He left the room. Claire remained still, staring at her name inked onto the page like a sentence. Everything had just changed, and there was no way back. Claire's voice trembled as she clutched the papers in her hands. You want me to carry the child, and then leave it with you?" Nathaniel folded his arms. His face remained unreadable, his tone firm. "I need an heir. Once the baby is born, our arrangement ends. That's all in the contract." Claire stood up, her breath catching in her throat as waves of anger and disbelief surged through her. "I can't do this," she whispered. "You're asking me to walk away from my own child. That's not something I can just sign off on. Nathaniel's expression didn't waver. You knew the terms when you stepped into that auction. Regret wasn't part of the agreement. She tightened her grip on the contract, her knuckles turning white. This is cruel, she said, voice rising. Do you really believe you can buy a child and erase the mother like she never existed? He stepped toward her slowly, his presence heavy and commanding. I paid $1 million for this contract, Miss Monroe, he said, voice low and calm. This isn't about feelings. You agreed. Now you fulfill your part. Claire's heart pounded in her chest. She felt the walls closing in. There was no way out. Not without losing everything she was trying to protect. Nathaniel placed a pen on the table in front of her. Sign it, he said. When the child is born, you'll be compensated. After that, you're free. She stared at the document again, her hands trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of what it meant. Ethan's face floated in her mind. The sleepless nights, the missed meals, the way he always believed she could fix anything. Tears stung the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She sat down, her voice barely a whisper. This still doesn't make it right. Nathaniel leaned in slightly, his eyes locked on hers. Right or wrong doesn't matter here, only what's agreed upon. Claire took the pen, and with every ounce of strength she could summon, she signed. He picked up the contract, scanned it quickly, and nodded. Very well. Tomorrow morning, you'll go through the medical evaluations. After that, I'll have a car bring you to the estate. Without another word, he left the room, leaving Claire alone in the quiet. The ink on the contract had barely dried, but it already felt like it had carved something permanent into her soul. The next morning, a sleek black limousine waited outside the small apartment complex Claire called home. She stood on the sidewalk, suitcase in hand, watching as Ethan waved from Mrs. Jenkins' window. She'd told him she had to leave for a new job far away, one that would help them both. He didn't understand, but he smiled anyway, trusting her like he always did. The ride was long and silent. Claire stared out the window as the modest streets of Ridgefield gave way to winding roads and sprawling private land. By the time they reached Cross Estate, the landscape had transformed entirely. Immaculate gardens, tall iron gates, and a mansion so grand it hardly looked real. Nathaniel stood at the front entrance, as composed as ever. I'll give you a quick overview of the house and the expectations, he said, leading her inside. Your privacy will be respected, but I expect full cooperation. No questions, no deviations. With that, he handed her off to a kind-faced woman named Margaret, the house manager. I'll show you to your room, Margaret said with a gentle smile. Claire followed, taking in the soft colors and elegant furnishings that lined the hallways. The contrast with her old apartment was staggering. In her room, everything had already been prepared, clothes in her size, skincare she'd never afford, even a basket of books. It felt like stepping into someone else's life. If you need anything, just call for me, Margaret said kindly. Thank you, Claire replied. Though her voice was hollow, that night she stepped out onto the small balcony attached to her suite. The stars above felt distant, and the ache in her chest, missing Ethan, was a quiet, persistent storm. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock. She turned to see Nathaniel at the door. Tomorrow morning, he said plainly, we'll visit the physician I trust. Be ready by 8. He left without waiting for her to answer. Claire stood there for a long time after, clutching the edge of the railing, feeling like a guest in someone else's story. But this was her reality now. There was no turning back. The next morning, Claire woke before the sun rose. The silence in the mansion was suffocating, thick and still, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. She hadn't slept. The bed, though luxurious, felt foreign. The sheets were silk, the pillows like clouds, but no softness could soothe the storm in her mind. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Ethan's face, his smile, his small hand waving goodbye. And she remembered she was here to give someone else a child while being forced to leave her own behind. A gentle knock broke the stillness. Margaret, ever calm and composed, stood at the door. "Good morning, Miss Monroe. Mr. Cross is ready for the appointment. I'll escort you downstairs." The halls of Cross Estate gleamed with quiet opulence. Persian rugs stretched endlessly down corridors, the walls adorned with original oil paintings, and the scent of fresh orchids lingering in the air. Sunlight spilled through tall windows, illuminating gardens so meticulously kept they looked painted. Claire hardly noticed. Her thoughts were far from the grandeur. A black limousine waited out front. The ride to the clinic was quiet. Nathaniel sat beside her, saying nothing, his eyes on his phone. She sat rigid, fingers clutched tightly in her lap. The doctor's office was nestled in the heart of the city, a sleek modern building wrapped in glass and steel. Inside, everything was sterile and silent. The physician, Dr. Langston, greeted her with a calming smile and warm handshake. He spoke gently, but the procedure was clinical, efficient, routine. After a full examination, Dr. Langston turned to Nathaniel with a nod. "She's in excellent condition. We can begin the initial process immediately." Claire nodded, unable to meet anyone's eyes. To Nathaniel, it was a step in a carefully calculated plan. To Claire, it felt like the beginning of a countdown to heartbreak, to loss, to something she couldn't undo. Back at the mansion, Claire tried to distract herself by wandering the endless rooms of the estate. Every corner revealed another layer of extravagance: an indoor pool framed by marble pillars, a library stretching 2 stories high, a music room filled with instruments from around the world. It was breathtaking, and yet empty. Everything was beautiful, but nothing felt alive. Nathaniel was rarely seen. When he did appear, it was all business, quick check-ins, short confirmations, no conversation, no warmth. He moved through his own home like a shadow, controlled, cold, unreachable. Claire began to understand. He wasn't just powerful, he was lonely. At night, she lay awake in her ornate bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, wondering what Ethan was dreaming about. Was he eating enough? Was he scared? Did he miss her? Each morning, she woke with a deeper ache, and the reality settled in more cruelly each day. She was going to carry a child that would never call her mom. By the second week, Nathaniel informed her of a formal dinner he was hosting: investors, clients, business allies. "You'll need to attend," he said, eyes steady. "It's part of the agreement." Claire dressed in a gown that had been left for her dark emerald satin that flowed like water. When she stepped onto the grand staircase, the chatter below quieted. All eyes turned toward her. Some guests nodded politely, others whispered, eyes lingering too long. Nathaniel, to her surprise, stayed by her side the entire evening. "This is Claire Monroe," he said more than once, a personal guest. They stepped aside to a quiet corner at one point. His voice lowered. "Are you all right?" She was startled by the concern. "I'm trying," she replied honestly. He nodded, offering no further words. For him, the event was a transaction, another task. For Claire, it was stepping into a world where she didn't belong. That night, drained and heavy-hearted, she climbed the stairs and locked herself in her room. She called Mrs. Jenkins. "Can I talk to Ethan?" His voice burst through the phone with joy. "Mom, I missed you!" Claire smiled, fighting the tears that burned behind her eyes. "I missed you too, sweetheart. I'll call again soon, okay?" After the call ended, she sat in silence. The emptiness was louder than ever, but something subtle began to shift. She started to notice things small: nearly hidden details about Nathaniel. One afternoon, she passed the greenhouse and saw him kneeling beside a delicate bonsai tree, trimming it with the care of someone who rarely touched anything gently. She paused, just long enough to be noticed. He didn't speak, just nodded once, and went back to pruning. It was the first time she saw him, not as the man who bought her future, but as a man quietly fighting the ghosts of his past. One afternoon, as Claire wandered through the estate's gardens, she came across a quiet moment that caught her off guard. Nathaniel Cross, the man who rarely touched anything that didn't serve a purpose, was kneeling by a small tree, gently watering its roots with a care that felt personal. She slowed her steps, watching from a distance. It wasn't just any plant. There was something sacred in the way he handled it. He looked up, sensing her gaze. For a moment, they simply stood in silence before he spoke, his voice softer than usual. "This tree belonged to my mother," he said. "She used to say that tending to it made the world feel less chaotic." Claire didn't respond right away. Her heart stirred with something unexpected. Empathy, maybe, or recognition. In that moment, Nathaniel didn't look like the man who bought her future. He looked like a son still trying to hold on to something he'd lost. Over the days that followed, Claire found herself talking more with Margaret, the housekeeper. As they folded linens or passed in the halls, Margaret began sharing pieces of Nathaniel's past, how he'd lost both parents before he was 20, how the empire he now controlled had been thrust onto his shoulders far too young. "He never had time to grieve properly," Margaret said one afternoon. "He just learned to hide it behind boardrooms and contracts." Those words stayed with Claire. She had been trying so hard to keep her distance to protect herself. But the longer she stayed, the more she saw. Beneath the surface, Nathaniel Cross was a man carved by responsibility and loneliness, just like she was shaped by sacrifice. Even so, she tried not to get attached. The mansion, with all its beauty, still wasn't home. And Nathaniel wasn't someone she could afford to understand too deeply. After all, her time there was supposed to be temporary. And yet, under the stillness, something was shifting. She found comfort in the gardens, in the way the sunlight streamed through the trees, in the sound of water trickling from the fountains. There in the quiet, her heart slowed, her thoughts found rhythm. Nathaniel often spent time in the same spaces, though he never initiated conversation. Still, she could sense his presence. He noticed her, even if he didn't always speak. There was tension, unspoken but palpable, a kind of curiosity suspended between two people who never intended to connect. One afternoon, she saw him again, this time carefully pruning the very tree from earlier. She hesitated, then stepped a little closer. "Do you like gardening?" she asked, gently breaking the silence. He didn't look up. "It helps me organize my thoughts," he replied. Claire stood quietly for a moment. It wasn't much, but it was something, a crack in the armor. She didn't push further. She didn't need to. In that small exchange, she understood. He wasn't unreachable, just guarded. That night, as Claire was preparing for bed, there was a knock at her door. She opened it to find Nathaniel, his usual formality softened by something more hesitant. "Can we talk?" he asked. She stepped aside, letting him in. He sat down, and for the first time, he looked unsure, like the man who had planned every detail of his life was searching for words he didn't know how to say. "I know this arrangement. It's not easy for you," he began, "and I've made no effort to pretend otherwise. But for what it's worth, I see your strength. I see what it takes for you to do this." Claire blinked, surprised by his tone. It wasn't cold. It wasn't distant. It was human. And in his eyes, she saw it vulnerability. Not pity, not guilt. just quiet truth. It was the first time she thought maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as unfeeling as he seemed. Maybe beneath the rigid lines of control, there was a heart quietly breaking too. After he left, she sat alone in her room, staring at the closed door. Something had shifted, and she couldn't ignore it anymore. Life at Cross Estate settled into a quiet rhythm. Days passed slowly, but not without meaning. Claire still felt afraid of what was coming, but now, that fear shared space with something else: curiosity. Who was this man who had asked her for a child, and started to show glimpses of a soul he'd kept buried for years? The garden became her sanctuary. She noticed things now: a bird returning to the same branch each morning, the way the breeze moved through the roses, and how Nathaniel always seemed to appear just as she was about to leave. He rarely spoke, but he was there. One afternoon, as she passed the same tree, she saw him again, focused, quiet, lost in thought. He didn't speak when she approached, but this time he didn't retreat either. Claire tried to ignore it, this growing curiosity about the man behind the perfectly pressed suits and emotionally distant tone. But that evening, something shifted. For the first time since she arrived at Cross Estate, Nathaniel joined her for dinner. Until then, she'd eaten alone. Meals were brought to her room or served quietly in a sunlit corner of the house. But tonight, he sat across from her at the long mahogany table, pouring himself a glass of red wine with practiced ease. "Are you adjusting?" he asked, his voice low but sincere. Claire looked up, caught off guard by the question. "I think so," she replied, careful to steady her dead tone. "As much as I can." Nathaniel watched her for a moment, studying her expression as though trying to read a page just out of reach. "I know it's not easy," he said finally, "but I hope you understand this was necessary." Claire wanted to ask, necessary for whom, but she kept the thought to herself. She only nodded and returned to her plate in silence. Still, something in his words lingered, the way he said them, as if he wasn't just talking about logistics, but about something heavier he'd never learned to share. The days passed, slow but revealing. Claire began noticing small gestures, quiet things that said more than his carefully chosen words ever did. One morning, Margaret arrived at her door with a tray of food that made Claire freeze. "Cornbread," she whispered, eyes widening, "and roasted squash." "My grandmother used to make this." Margaret smiled kindly. "Mr. Cross asked the kitchen to prepare it, said you'd mentioned it in passing." Claire couldn't respond. She simply sat, staring at the tray, moved by the fact that he had listened. Another morning, she found a stack of books arranged neatly on her bedside table, titles she loved, some she hadn't read since college, others she'd only mentioned once in casual conversation. He remembered, and it warmed something in her, a part of herself she hadn't let anyone reach in a long time. Then came the music room. She hadn't meant to intrude. She was walking the hall when she heard it, soft, delicate piano notes floating under the door like whispers. Curious, she pushed it open slightly. There he was. Nathaniel Cross, the untouchable businessman, seated at the grand piano, his fingers moving with grace and memory. "You play," she said quietly. He turned, startled, his hands stilled on the keys. "My mother taught me," he said, almost embarrassed, "when I was a boy." "It's beautiful," Claire said, stepping in. He nodded once, then looked away, unsure how to accept the compliment. In that moment, she saw a side of him, untouched by power or contracts, a boy who'd once believed music could keep sorrow at bay. Another time, she was in the garden when a small bird fell from a low branch, its wing trembling. Without hesitation, Claire knelt, gently scooping the creature into her hands. Nathaniel appeared a moment later, watching from a short distance. "What will you do with it?" he asked. She looked up, firm. Take care of it, until it can fly again. He said nothing, but there was a softness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. A quiet admiration he didn't bother to hide. That moment lingered between them, brief, but deeply felt. Nights in the mansion were still lonely, but Claire had found comfort in small rituals, wandering candle-lit corridors, pausing by tall windows to watch the wind sway through the trees, tracing her fingers along the spines of books in the vast library. One night, she crossed paths with Nathaniel in the hallway. He looked different, less guarded, tired but human. Can't sleep? He asked. Claire hesitated. Too much on my mind, she admitted. He nodded slowly, as if understanding all too well. Then, surprisingly, he gestured down the hall. Come. I was about to make tea. They sat together in the library, surrounded by warm lamplight and shelves that smelled of time and parchment. The conversation started slow, but it stretched longer than either of them expected. They talked about books, about old memories, about silence, and how some people wear it like armor. And for the first time since arriving, Claire felt like she wasn't just surviving, she was being seen. Even Margaret noticed the change. She started treating Claire less like a guest and more like someone who might actually belong. There was kindness in her tone, warmth in her glances, and an ease that hadn't been there before. Something was shifting. And for the first time, Claire didn't want to fight it. Margaret had started treating Claire more like a friend than a guest. Even Nathaniel, though he still clung to formality, seemed different in her presence. Less guarded, his posture remained straight, his voice measured, but the way he looked at her had shifted, as if he no longer saw her as a contract, but as someone he was beginning to truly notice. Claire, in turn, felt the change too. Despite the cold clarity of their arrangement, she found herself slipping into small moments that felt unexpectedly human. Shared glances, quiet conversations, a warmth in a house that had once felt like a gilded cage. But even as something gentle began to stir between them, the truth never left her. It clung like a shadow. This was temporary. The clock was ticking, and the child she would carry would not be hers to keep. Still, the first signs of something deeper had begun to show. She wasn't just observing Nathaniel anymore, she was beginning to understand him, and in understanding, she began to care. Time passed slowly at Cross Estate, but it wasn't empty. Claire found herself more and more immersed in the rhythm of the house. She stopped counting the days, she stopped checking the calendar, and Nathaniel, he changed too subtly, but undeniably. One afternoon, while they sat in the garden watching the sun warm the ivy-covered walls, he said something that caught her completely off guard. I see something in you, he said, without looking at her. Something steady, something that could shape the future if it's given the right care. Claire didn't answer right away, but the words settled in her chest like a quiet flame. He was no longer speaking to her like an employer or even just a man bound by duty. He was opening a door, even if only a crack. It was in the little things. He started asking about her favorite books, her favorite time of day, the food she missed from home, and when she mentioned her love for mint tea on rainy mornings, Margaret brought it to her exactly the way she liked it. Mr. Cross mentioned it. The housekeeper smiled. Claire didn't know what to say, but she felt it. The walls were lowering, one brick at a time. Their conversations in the garden became a quiet routine. So did the evenings in the library, where they sat beneath soft lamplight, trading stories and thoughts like old friends trying to rebuild trust they never had. One evening, as dusk settled over the estate, Nathaniel turned to her and asked quietly, "If you could change anything about your past, would you?" The question hung in the air. Claire thought for a long moment before answering. I think I would have been more careful about who I trusted. She paused, then added, more softly, but at the same time, if I hadn't made those mistakes, I wouldn't have Ethan. His name filled the room like a whisper from another world. Nathaniel didn't speak, he just gave a quiet nod, sensing the weight behind every syllable. Still, despite their growing closeness, Claire remained cautious. She couldn't forget the contract. Couldn't forget that all of this, the walks, the books, the kindness, was wrapped in something finite. No matter how much she had begun to like Nathaniel, her time there was not promised. One night, she stood on her balcony, eyes lifted to the stars, the sky stretched wide and silent, as if holding secrets she wasn't meant to know. Behind her, the door creaked open. Nathaniel joined her, saying nothing at first. They stood side by side, in the quiet, just breathing. "You think a lot about the future?" he finally said. Claire didn't deny it. "I can't help it. All of this feels temporary." He turned, his gaze meeting hers, not cold or distant, but filled with a gravity she hadn't seen before. "The future isn't something we wait for," he said. "It's something we shape, with what we choose right now." His words didn't come with promises, but they carried something just as powerful: hope. For the first time, Claire allowed herself to believe that maybe not everything was already written, and others had begun to notice, too. Margaret smiled more easily now. The staff moved with a quiet lightness that hadn't been there before. Even Claire could feel it. She was changing, slowly, gently. For the first time in months, she felt like she was beginning to return to herself, not the woman who had been forced to make an impossible choice, but the one who still believed in second chances. There were moments when Claire felt like she was rediscovering pieces of herself she thought she had lost. Laughter came a little easier. The silence didn't always feel heavy. And Nathaniel Cross no longer felt like a stranger behind a contract. But deep down, she knew she was approaching a crossroads. The feelings growing between them were real, and that made everything more complicated. She hadn't expected this bond, and certainly hadn't prepared for what it would cost her. And then, there was the secret. Ethan. She had never told Nathaniel about her son, and with every passing day, the guilt grew heavier. The thought of him finding out on his own kept her up at night. But so did the fear that telling him would undo everything they were slowly building. That morning, the soft light of dawn filled the mansion, but Claire felt anything but calm. After breakfast, she wandered into the gardens to clear her mind. The flowers, the breeze, the quiet rhythm of the estate, it usually soothed her. But not today. "Claire!" Margaret's voice rang out, urgent. Claire turned, alarmed, and hurried back toward the mansion. When she entered the living room, she froze. Nathaniel stood in the center of the room, a photo in his hand. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was calm and laced with tension. "Who is this boy?" Claire's heart stopped. The photo was one of the few she'd brought, with her Ethan's school portrait, tucked deep in her suitcase. She'd hidden it carefully, but somehow he had found it. She stepped forward, her voice trembling. "He's my son?" The silence that followed felt like it could swallow the room. Nathaniel looked directly at her. "You lied to me." His voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp, controlled, heavy. "Why didn't you tell me from the beginning?" Tears burned at the edge of her vision, but Claire forced herself to stand tall. "Because I was afraid," she said, barely above a whisper. "Afraid it would ruin everything, that you'd see me as unfit, that you'd cancel the contract and send me away." Nathaniel's eyes narrowed. "You agreed to carry a child for me, while leaving your own behind. Why?" Claire's breath caught, but then she spoke, honestly, letting the words fall without hiding the pain behind them. "I did it for him, for Ethan. I couldn't pay the rent. I couldn't keep the lights on. There were nights he went to bed hungry, I didn't know what else to do. Nathaniel turned away, walking slowly toward the window. He stood there for a long time, staring out at the horizon. You should have trusted me, he said quietly. And just like that, the weight of disappointment in his voice broke something inside her. Claire's tears came silently. She knew this moment could destroy everything they'd been building, but the truth had been clawing at her for so long, and now it was out. That evening, Nathaniel summoned her to the library. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with unspoken words. A folder sat open on the desk in front of him. He looked up as she entered, then motioned for her to sit. I've reviewed our agreement, he said evenly. There's no clause that addresses something like this, no mention of personal secrets, or what happens when trust is broken. Claire felt her heart race. Please, she whispered, don't send me away. I'll still honor everything we agreed to. Nathaniel raised a hand to stop her. I'm not asking you to leave, he said, but trust Claire. It matters. And now we need to rebuild it. He slid a sheet of paper across the desk toward her. I want you to see him. You're allowed to visit Ethan. Claire's eyes widened in disbelief. But there's one condition, he continued. He can't know the truth, not yet. Not about you being here, or about this agreement. Claire stared at the paper, stunned. She wasn't expecting this kindness, this grace, and it made her guilt hit even harder. Why, she asked, her voice barely audible. Why would you do this? Nathaniel leaned back, folding his hands. His voice, when it came, was quieter than she'd ever heard it. Because I know what it's like to grow up without answers, and I don't want that for him, not completely. Let him have you, even if it's just in pieces. That's more than I ever had. Claire looked at him, and for the first time, she truly saw him not as the man who controlled her future, but as someone who had spent his whole life building walls to survive his own pain. And in that moment, something between them changed, deepened. Not because the truth had been easy to hear, but because it had finally been spoken. Nathaniel Cross was no longer just the man behind a contract. Claire had begun to see something deeper in him, scars carefully hidden beneath the polished surface, the kind carried by someone who had known loss too young and learned too early to survive without softness. The next day, Nathaniel kept his word. A car was waiting for Claire at sunrise. The journey was long, but every mile brought her closer to the one thing her heart ached for, Ethan. The moment she stepped out of the car, he came running, small arms flung around her waist, his laughter rising like music. Mommy, you're back! Claire dropped to her knees and wrapped him in her arms, pressing her face into his hair, willing the moment to last forever. But even in that joy, her heart was heavy. She knew this visit was temporary. She knew she would have to say goodbye again, soon. They spent the day just like they used to, playing with sidewalk chalk, reading under the porch light, sharing peanut butter sandwiches cut into stars. For a little while, the world faded away, but as the sun began to set, the shadows returned. When it was time to go, Ethan clung to her tightly. When will you be back, Mommy? Claire smiled, even though her throat burned. Soon, baby, I promise. She didn't know how true that was, but in that moment, it was all she could give him. Back at Cross Estate, she walked through the front doors, completely drained physically, emotionally, soul-deep weary. Nathaniel was waiting in the living room, standing beside the fireplace. His expression was calm, but his eyes searched hers with quiet concern. How is he? He asked. Claire sank into the couch, her arms still aching from the goodbye. He's happy, healthy, she said softly, but leaving him? It never gets easier. Nathaniel nodded slowly, saying nothing more, but something in his gaze said he understood more than words ever could. In the days that followed, the atmosphere between them shifted. There was a stillness to it, a quiet understanding, an unspoken respect. It wasn't forced, and it wasn't rushed. It simply grew. Little gestures began to matter. They shared meals without pretense, walked through the garden without purpose, spoke in the library without script. One evening, as dusk settled outside the tall windows, Nathaniel spoke in a voice softer than usual. "My mother died when I was 11. Claire looked up. "My father, he buried himself in business after that. I had to grow up faster than I wanted to, took on responsibilities before I even understood what they meant." Claire watched him, surprised by his openness. "That must have been lonely." "It was," he replied. "Still is, sometimes." He looked down at his hands. "I don't think that part ever leaves." Claire wanted to reach out, to comfort him, but she didn't. Not yet. Still, the walls between them felt thinner now. That small moment of vulnerability had brought them closer than anything else could. As the months passed, their relationship continued to evolve. What had started as a cold, calculated agreement began to resemble something deeper, something real. Claire started to see Nathaniel, not as a tycoon or a contract holder, but as a man flawed, thoughtful, human. And Nathaniel began to see Claire not as a surrogate, but as a woman with a fire in her, and a softness that refused to be hardened by circumstance. After her visit with Ethan, a strange calm settled over the mansion. It wasn't silence anymore. It was peace. Their dynamic had shifted. What had once been tense and transactional now carried a quiet ease, like two people learning how to breathe in each other's space. Claire still held tight to her routines. Morning walks, quiet afternoons in the library, evenings on the balcony, tracing constellations with her eyes. But Ethan was never far from her thoughts. His voice echoed in her heart. One morning, as Claire sat sipping coffee by the tall window in the breakfast nook, Nathaniel entered, more relaxed than usual. There was a hint of something lighter in his face, maybe even warmth. "I want you to come with me today," he said. Claire looked up, curious. "Where?" "I've got a meeting at one of my family's properties," he said, his tone casual. "It's quiet, peaceful. I think you'll like it. I think you'll like it," Nathaniel said softly. Claire hesitated, but only for a moment. Any excuse to step beyond the mansion walls, even briefly, was welcome. She nodded, quietly agreeing. The car ride was calm. Quiet, but not in a way that felt strained. Nathaniel drove with an ease she hadn't seen in him before. Claire sat beside him, watching the scenery blur past urban buildings, giving way to open landscapes, city noise dissolving into quiet. After nearly an hour, they turned down a dusty road, where the land stretched wide and golden beneath the afternoon sky. At the end stood a modest house, warm, sun-bleached wood and stone, surrounded by dunes and solitude. "This was my mother's place," Nathaniel said as they stepped out. "She used to come here when she needed to breathe." Claire followed him inside. Unlike the mansion, which always felt curated and controlled, this house felt lived in. The walls were lined with woven tapestries, soft rugs underfoot, and old lanterns that cast golden glows. The scent of rosemary and citrus lingered in the air. They stepped out onto a back terrace. Beyond them, the desert rolled endlessly, kissed by the wind. Claire sat down in a wooden chair, drawing in the stillness like breath. "I can think here," Nathaniel said quietly, settling beside her. "Nowhere else feels quite like this." "It's beautiful," Claire replied, her eyes on the horizon. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then he asked, almost cautiously, "Do you miss home?" She turned to look at him. "I miss what it meant, not the walls or the space, but what it held, the memories, the simplicity." He nodded, and something softened between them. No pretense, no power dynamics, just two people sharing silence that said more than words ever could. After that trip, Something shifted gently, unmistakably. Nathaniel began inviting Claire into more of his world. Meetings with staff, small decisions about the house, discussions about how things were run. She wasn't just a guest anymore. She was becoming a part of the rhythm. One evening, over dinner, he said something that made her pause. "I've been thinking about making changes to the mansion." Claire raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Changes?" He nodded slowly. "I want it to feel warmer. Less like a museum, more like a home." She studied him. "For guests?" He looked down at his plate, then back up quietly. "For a family." Her heart stilled. It was the first time he had spoken aloud about a future that might extend beyond a contract. And even though nothing was certain, it meant something. One afternoon, as Claire strolled through the garden, she spotted Margaret carrying a tray of tea and cookies, humming softly. "You seem happy," Claire said with a smile. "Something happened?" Margaret's eyes sparkled. "It's just nice to see the house alive again. It hasn't felt this way in a long time." Claire felt her cheeks warm. She didn't respond, but she knew exactly what Margaret meant. And though her future still felt like a puzzle, missing half its pieces, she couldn't deny it. Something was blooming. Nathaniel changed too. He smiled more often, real, quiet smiles. He lingered at bars, in conversations. He started asking Claire questions not out of politeness, but genuine curiosity. Their talks, once guarded, now stretched for hours, sometimes over books, sometimes under stars. And one evening, beneath the library's golden light, he told her something that struck her deeply. "I never learned how to grieve," he said. His voice was low, almost fragile. "When my mother died, everything shifted. She was the heart of the family. When she was gone, it all collapsed." Claire listened, unmoving. She saw the weight in his posture, the distance in his eyes, the kind of pain that didn't scream, but lived in silence. "I've never really stopped carrying it," he added. She reached across the armrest, letting her fingers rest lightly against his hand, not to fix it, not to offer platitudes, just to say, "I see you." Because she did. She knew what it meant to lose someone, even if the ways were different. Claire was no longer the same woman who had first walked into Cross Estate, and Nathaniel was no longer the man who greeted her with cold formality and a signed contract. Whatever they were becoming, it was real, and it was growing. The moment they shared on that quiet evening didn't fade, it deepened. Though they never spoke of it directly, something between Claire and Nathaniel had shifted. A soft, steady closeness had begun to settle between them, threading itself into their days like sunlight through a curtain. But even with that warmth growing, Claire knew the truth. The contract was still there. As much as her heart was leaning toward him, reality had not changed. She still lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand what the future could look like and if it would allow her to stay. One night, there was a knock on her bedroom door. Claire opened it to find Nathaniel standing there, his expression uncertain, like a man carrying more than he could say. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly. She nodded and stepped aside, watching him settle into the chair across from her bed. "I know we have boundaries," he said, choosing his words carefully, "but I'm trying to understand what this is, what it's becoming." Her heart beat faster. There was something in his voice, unsure, searching, that felt more honest than anything he'd said before. "I'm trying to understand it too," she replied, just as honestly. Nathaniel nodded, and for a moment the silence between them wasn't heavy, it was hopeful. The change didn't go unnoticed. Margaret, always observant, remarked how Nathaniel seemed lighter, more present. Other staff members commented on how Claire had brought life back into the house. The once cold, quiet mansion had taken on warmth, laughter, and light, and Claire felt it too. Despite the contract, despite the uncertainty, She was beginning to see Cross Estate not as a place she was passing through, but as something closer to a home, even if she didn't know how long it would last. Every night, as she gazed up at the stars from her balcony, she felt it in her chest. She was standing at a threshold. Something was changing. Something real was forming. The days passed, and so did the boundaries. A brush of hands when passing in the hallway, shared stories over tea, lingering glances that spoke louder than words. Each moment, each gesture, brought them closer to a line neither of them had expected to cross. One morning, Claire walked into Nathaniel's office with a small tray coffee, a croissant, and a note tucked beneath the napkin. He looked up, clearly surprised. "I thought you could use a break," she said, trying to sound casual. Nathaniel stared at the tray for a moment, then offered a tired smile. "Thank you," he said. "Lately it's been hard to focus." Claire sat down in the chair opposite him. "Is it something with the business?" He shook his head. "No, just everything. A lot to process." Silence settled between them. Not awkward, just full of unspoken things. Finally, Claire asked quietly, "Do you think you've made the right decisions?" Nathaniel looked at her, something soft in his expression. "I've spent my life making practical choices, strategic ones, but lately, I wonder if I've been too rigid, if I've missed what really matters." Claire nodded, heart heavy with empathy. For the first time, he wasn't just a man holding everything together, he was someone asking himself if he'd been holding on to the wrong things. After that, the rhythm of their days changed again. Nathaniel started inviting Claire to accompany him on walks, to meetings, even social events. He included her not as a formality, but as someone who mattered. During a charity dinner at a grand downtown venue, he introduced her without hesitation. "This is Claire Monroe," he said, "my companion." The word hung in the air. Around them conversations quieted, eyes turned. Claire felt their stares, like heat against her skin. Nathaniel, however, remained unfazed. The opinions of others meant little to him, but Claire, she wasn't used to the attention, the labels, the questions behind every glance. As they stepped away from the crowd, he leaned closer. "Are you all right?" She met his eyes. "I'm getting used to it," she said honestly. And she was, slowly, carefully, because no matter how fragile the path they were walking, Claire knew something undeniable now. This wasn't just a contract anymore. It was becoming something real. Claire smiled, though her heart was racing. She wasn't sure what surprised her more, Nathaniel taking her hand, or how natural it felt. His grip was warm, reassuring. "Don't worry," he said softly. "I'm here with you." Simple words. But they melted something inside her. From that moment on, their intimacy deepened, not in grand gestures, but in quiet ones. The kind that slip in between moments and settle in the soul. Nathaniel began sharing parts of himself Claire never thought he'd reveal. He told her about his childhood, how every decision had been shaped by legacy, not love, how expectations crushed most of his dreams before they had the chance to grow. In return, Claire opened up too. She spoke about raising Ethan alone, about the nights she couldn't afford both food and rent, and how even in the darkest times, Ethan's laughter had kept her from breaking. Nathaniel listened without interruption. No judgment, just presence. And in that stillness, something bloomed. One night, they were walking through the garden under a sky washed in silver moonlight. Nathaniel suddenly stopped and turned to her. "Claire," he said quietly, "since you came here, I've started to see things I never allowed myself to notice before." She blinked. "Like what?" "That there's more to life than deals and contracts. That sometimes you need to make space for something unexpected." Her heart skipped. She knew what he meant. She was feeling it too. But the contract still lingered in the background, a shadow neither of them could fully escape. Margaret had noticed the change. She smiled more around Claire, her glances carrying warmth, as if she'd already accepted her as part of the family. The other staff members exchanged quiet nods and knowing looks. Even so, Claire couldn't shake the fear. With every passing day, the end of the contract loomed nearer. The thought of having to walk away from all of this, from him, gnawed at her. One afternoon, while Claire was reading in the library, Nathaniel entered with a look she hadn't seen before, serious, contemplative. "We need to talk," he said, closing the door behind him. She set the book aside, her heartbeat picking up. "What's wrong?" He sat across from her, hands clasped tightly. "I've been thinking about the future." She stayed silent, waiting. "I know what the contract says. I know what we agreed. But things have changed." Claire's breath caught. She had imagined this conversation 100 times, but nothing could prepare her for hearing it aloud. "What do you mean?" she asked, voice barely a whisper. "I mean," Nathaniel said slowly, "I don't want you to leave. I want us to find a way to make this work, together." Those words echoed through her like a drumbeat. Exactly what she had longed for, and exactly what terrified her. "And what does that look like?" she asked, her voice shaking. "It means figuring it out," he said. "Not just for the baby, for us, for you and me." In the days that followed, something new took root: honesty. They began speaking openly, no longer dancing around their feelings. Claire confessed her fears about losing herself, about whether she could be strong enough to let go of the past. Nathaniel admitted his own, that he might never be free from the weight of his family's expectations, that vulnerability was still something that scared him. But through those confessions, they found something powerful: each other. One quiet evening, they stood together on the terrace, stars overhead like silent witnesses. Claire leaned into the railing, arms folded, the cool night breeze brushing her face. Nathaniel stood beside her, quiet, then turned toward her. "I didn't know what love was," he said, his voice raw and unfiltered, "until you walked into my life." Tears welled in Claire's eyes, but this time, they weren't from sorrow. They were from something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Cross Estate had once been cold and silent, a place of walls and contracts. But now, it was something else. It was becoming a home. The mansion had begun to feel like something. It was never meant to be a place with the potential to be home. And the bond between Claire and Nathaniel, it had grown beyond the boundaries of paper and ink. It was something living, breathing. That evening, as the sun slipped behind the hills, casting golden light through the tall windows, Claire sat in the music room, her quiet haven. Her fingers danced softly over the piano keys, weaving a wistful melody that echoed through the room like a memory. Nathaniel entered quietly, standing in the doorway for a moment before speaking. "Did you teach yourself to play?" Claire looked up, surprised, but offered a soft smile. "My mother taught me when I was young. It was our way of staying connected, especially during hard times." He stepped closer, then gently sat beside her on the bench. For a moment, he simply watched her hands glide over the ivory keys. "You have a gift?" he said softly. Claire stopped playing. The room felt full of something unspoken. Nathaniel's voice broke the silence. "I've been thinking about everything we've shared, about how we ended up here." She turned toward him, her heart steadying. His eyes held a seriousness she hadn't seen before. "And what are you thinking?" she asked. He drew in a breath, deeper than usual. "That I can't keep pretending this is just an arrangement, that what's grown between us doesn't matter." Claire's heart fluttered with a mix of hope and fear. Nathaniel rarely spoke of his feelings, and when he did, it meant something. Later that evening, he asked her to walk with him through the gardens. The trees swayed gently in the breeze. The sky was painted with fading light, and the silence between them felt both tender and heavy. My father was a hard man, Nathaniel began quietly. Everything was about the family name, reputation, control. Claire listened, her steps slowing to match his. After my mother passed, he became even more rigid. It was like love had no place in our world anymore, only duty. She reached for his hand just briefly, a quiet gesture of understanding. "And is that why you wanted an heir?" she asked. Nathaniel stopped, looking out across the garden before turning to her. "Yes, partly. But also," he hesitated, "because I've spent most of my life afraid of ending up alone." Claire's heart ached at the honesty in his voice. She understood that fear all too well. The next morning, Nathaniel asked her to come with him to a place far from the estate. They left early, driving deep into the desert. The world opened up around them, vast and golden, stretching endlessly under the morning sun. Eventually, they arrived at a secluded oasis, tucked between dunes like a secret. "This is where I come when I need clarity," Nathaniel said. "It reminds me that even in the harshest places, life still finds a way." They walked quietly along the water's edge, palm trees swaying above them, the desert breeze cool and cleansing. Under the shade of one tree, they sat together. Nathaniel stared out across the still water. "I've spent so long living by the rules of others' expectations, traditions, legacy," he said, "and I've never stopped to ask myself what I want." Claire looked at him, her chest rising and falling with the weight of the moment. "And what do you want now?" she asked. He turned to face her, eyes bright in the sunlight. "I want to live differently," he said. "I want to build something that's mine, real, not born from contracts or fear, but from choice, from love." Claire felt her throat tighten. Tears stung her eyes, but they didn't fall. Those words, they were everything she had once only dared to hope for. Even after everything that had been said, uncertainties still lingered. When Claire and Nathaniel returned to the estate, there was a quiet ease between them, but also an unspoken understanding. They weren't finished. Not yet. There were still layers of truth to uncover and fears to face. Claire spent many nights wide awake, replaying every step that had led her there. Her heart ached most when she thought of Ethan, what it would mean for him, for his future, and for the kind of mother she wanted to be. If she was going to move forward, she had to face her own wounds, not just hide behind the warmth that Nathaniel had given her. One evening, she stood out on the balcony beneath a sky scattered with stars. The air was cool, and the horizon shimmered with twilight. Nathaniel joined her, quietly, holding 2 mugs of tea. He handed her one without a word and stood beside her, letting the silence settle between them. "You know," he said eventually, his voice barely above a whisper, "I never thought I'd meet someone who could make me question everything I believed." Claire turned to look at him, her chest tightening at the vulnerability in his tone. "You've shown me that there's more," he continued. "More than obligation, more than legacy. That maybe there's room for something real." Claire gave him a soft smile, her eyes glistening. "And you've shown me that strength can be found even in pain, that I didn't have to do this alone." Their hands brushed on the balcony rail, neither of them pulled away. Over the next few days, Nathaniel began taking real steps to reflect the shift between them. He brought out the original contract, once rigid and absolute, and began revisiting its terms. Though some clauses about the child's future remained, he told Claire plainly, "I want to find a way forward that's fair. For all of us." Claire felt a mix of relief and quiet fear. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be smooth, but at last, they were walking it together. The energy in Cross Estate changed. Where once cold silence reigned, now soft conversation filled the halls. Nathaniel smiled more. Claire moved with ease. Margaret noticed it all, of course. I always knew Mr. Cross had a heart, she told Claire one afternoon, her eyes twinkling. He just needed someone brave enough to help him find it. Claire's heart swelled with gratitude. For the journey, for the change, for the man who once kept everyone out and was now learning to let someone in. Despite everything, Claire never let herself forget. The future was still uncertain. She and Nathaniel would need to fight for what they were building. But, for the first time, she believed they could. As another sun dipped below the horizon, Claire and Nathaniel sat together on the terrace, shoulder to shoulder. They didn't say much. They didn't need to. The silence between them no longer felt heavy. It felt like promise. The following morning, Nathaniel called Claire to his office. The room, usually so formal and austere, felt softer somehow, more personal. He gestured to the seat across from him, and Claire sat, her hands folded in her lap, waiting. "I've been thinking," he said. His voice was steady, but laced with something deeper, about everything that's happened since the day you walked in. Claire didn't speak. She only listened. "When I created this contract," he continued, "it was all about one thing, securing a future for the family name, an heir." He paused, then looked her in the eyes. "But now, I can't pretend that's all this is." Claire's heart began to race. "I can't ignore how I feel. I can't act like what's grown between us is just a side effect of circumstance." Her voice was soft. "And what are you saying?" Nathaniel leaned forward, his words clear. "I want to find a way to make this work, not because of a contract, but because I choose you. I want you to stay, not as a condition, but as a partner." Claire blinked, overwhelmed. The words she had once only dreamed of were now real, spoken aloud, unfiltered and full of meaning. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like someone passing through. She felt like she belonged. What Nathaniel had said felt like a glimmer of hope, something Claire hadn't dared to imagine. But she also knew it wouldn't be that simple. There were layers to their story, responsibilities, a past neither of them could erase. And before she let herself believe in a future, she needed to be sure they were both ready for what it might cost. That afternoon, Claire walked through the gardens, her thoughts heavy but steady. She replayed Nathaniel's words over and over. She wanted to trust him. She wanted to believe that this could be real. But Ethan was still living in another city, and the contract still stipulated she would leave after the baby was born. Later, she found Margaret tending to the flowers near the central fountain hands, deep in the soil, humming quietly. "Margaret," Claire asked gently, "do you think I can trust him?" Margaret looked up, surprised, but her answer came without hesitation. "Mr. Cross is a man of his word. He doesn't say things lightly. And he's human, Claire, just like you. He's learning how to choose what matters, not just what's expected." Claire nodded slowly. Somehow, those words settled something in her heart. The next day, Nathaniel invited Claire to accompany him to an orphanage, a place he had quietly supported for years. But this time felt different. As they arrived, laughter echoed across the yard. Dozens of children ran to greet them, their energy infectious. Claire watched as Nathaniel, usually so composed, softened. He smiled, knelt, ruffled hair, listened. "You care deeply about them," Claire said, watching him from the side. Nathaniel's gaze stayed on the children as he replied, "They remind me what life's really about. Not titles, not legacy, just love, simplicity." Those words struck something in her clear and true. For the first time, she saw him not just letting go of control, but reaching toward something more authentic. Back at the estate, Nathaniel made a decision. He gathered his legal team and revised the contract. He removed several restrictions, most importantly, the clause that would have separated Claire from Ethan after the birth. When he handed her the new draft, her hands trembled. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. He looked her in the eye. "Because I don't want you to feel trapped. I want you to stay because you want to. Because you trust me, not because you're bound by paper." Tears spilled down her cheeks, but they weren't from fear. They were from relief. As the days passed, their relationship deepened further. The formality faded. Conversation flowed easily. They shared childhood memories, silly fears, private dreams. The mansion no longer felt like a palace. It felt like the beginning of something real. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, Nathaniel turned to her on the terrace. "Claire," he said softly, "I want to meet Ethan." She blinked, startled. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely. He's a part of you. And I want to know every part of your life." Claire felt her chest tighten. His words weren't just kind, they were commitment. The trip to see Ethan was filled with quiet anticipation. Nathaniel appeared calm, but Claire could tell he was nervous. When they arrived, Ethan spotted Claire and came running full speed into her arms. "Mommy!" She scooped him up, laughing through tears, holding him as if she'd never let go. Nathaniel stood nearby, watching with a soft smile. Claire crouched down beside Ethan and gently introduced them. "This is Nathaniel," she said. "He's a very special friend of mine." Ethan looked up, eyes wide with curiosity. "Are you Mommy's friend?" he asked. Nathaniel knelt, his voice warm and calm. "I am. And I hope we can be friends too." Claire watched as Ethan nodded, then reached out his hand. Nathaniel took it without hesitation. And in that moment, beneath the open sky and the quiet promise between them, Claire realized something she hadn't allowed herself to believe until now. This wasn't just a chapter. This was the start of something true. Ethan smiled, and Claire felt a wave of emotion crash over her: relief, joy, and something deeper: peace. The interaction between Nathaniel and her son had been so natural, so unforced. It was as if Ethan instinctively knew that Nathaniel was someone he could trust. Back at the estate, something shifted in Claire's heart. For the first time, she felt like she wasn't just staying there, she was building something. Her relationship with Nathaniel no longer stood on the foundation of a contract. It had grown into something real, something rooted in trust, compassion, and a kind of love neither of them had expected. Still, she knew the road ahead would require courage and patience. One evening, they stood under the stars again, the same way they had many nights before. But this time, Nathaniel reached for her hand. "I know we still have a lot to face," he said gently, "but I want you to know I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this work." Claire felt her eyes sting. For the first time, she truly believed in the possibility of a future together. Life at Cross Estate slowly began to feel like home. After the visit with Ethan, Nathaniel changed in quiet but unmistakable ways. He became more present, more attentive. He asked more about Claire's past, listened more intently to her stories. It was as if he had finally started to understand how much she had carried alone. One morning, as they shared coffee on the terrace, Nathaniel looked out toward the garden and said something that caught Claire completely off guard. "I want Ethan to live here." Claire nearly dropped her mug. "Are you serious?" she asked, barely able to believe it. Nathaniel turned to her, his voice steady. "Yes. If we're building a life together, he should be a part of it. From the beginning." Claire's heart swelled. It was everything she had hoped for, and yet part of her still hesitated. "But what about the contract?" she asked softly. Nathaniel paused before replying. "The contract doesn't have to be a barrier. We can revise it to make room for Ethan, for all of us, without compromising anything." Claire didn't answer right away. She couldn't. The gesture said more than any promise ever could. Preparations for Ethan's arrival began immediately. Nathaniel asked Margaret to ready a room and insisted that Claire choose everything. She filled it with soft blues, books Ethan loved, and small details from their old apartment, a baseball cap, a stuffed bear, a faded photo taped to the wall. She wanted him to feel at home, not just in a mansion, but in a new life. When the day came, Claire stood anxiously by the front door. The car pulled up, and the moment Ethan stepped inside, he ran straight into her arms. "Mom! This place is huge!" he said, spinning around with wide eyes. Nathaniel stood nearby, watching quietly. Then, with careful steps, he walked over and knelt to meet Ethan at eye level. "Welcome, Ethan," he said warmly. "I hope you'll like it here." Ethan extended a shy hand. "Thank you, sir." Nathaniel shook it gently and smiled. Claire watched the scene with her heart full. Even in Nathaniel's serious expression, she could see the effort he was making. The care, the intent. The first few days were full of adjustment and discovery. Ethan explored every hallway, asked 1,000 questions, and touched everything he wasn't supposed to. Nathaniel, to Claire's amazement, answered each of those questions with patience and even a sense of humor. One night, after tucking Ethan in, Claire leaned down to kiss his forehead. "Mom?" he asked sleepily. "Yes, baby?" "Is Mr. Nathaniel a good man?" The question took her breath away. She smiled and brushed his hair from his forehead. "He is. He's learning to be better every day." Ethan nodded, satisfied, and drifted off to sleep. Claire sat beside him, watching his chest rise and fall. For the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. As the days passed, Nathaniel and Ethan began forming their own bond. They played chess on rainy afternoons, took walks together in the garden. Nathaniel, once so guarded, began to laugh more, kneel down more, listen more. And one afternoon, as they walked hand in hand through the orchard, Ethan suddenly stopped and looked up at Nathaniel. "Do you like my mom?" he asked, wide-eyed and innocent. With the innocent curiosity only a child could have, Ethan looked up at Nathaniel and asked, "Do you like my mom?" Nathaniel chuckled, caught off guard by the boy's directness. "I do," he replied softly. "She's a very special woman." Ethan grinned and continued walking, his little footsteps echoing down the path. Nathaniel stood still for a moment, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. It was a simple exchange, but it meant the world. That afternoon, Claire walked into Nathaniel's office, holding a cup of tea. He was reviewing documents, his brow furrowed, completely immersed in work. She paused at the door. "Can I interrupt?" He looked up and smiled, instantly softening. "Always." Claire settled onto the nearby sofa, watching him as he returned to his papers. There was something incredibly grounding about it, seeing this man, once so guarded, now working tirelessly not just for legacy, but for them. "You're working so hard for us," she said quietly. Nathaniel set down his pen and met her eyes, "Because you're worth it." The simplicity of his words sent a ripple through her chest. Everything they had built, every moment, every risk, every step was real. The months passed quickly. Cross Estate no longer felt like a monument to wealth. It felt like home. The bond between Nathaniel and Claire only deepened, and Ethan became the beating heart of their household. The laughter, the shared meals, the slow dance of daily life, it all took root in love. And soon, there would be one more. Claire's belly grew, and so did their anticipation. One evening, as she rested on the terrace, a sudden discomfort took her by surprise. At first, she dismissed it as just another pregnancy ache, but the pain quickly intensified. Panicked, she called for Margaret, who rushed into the room and immediately called for Nathaniel. "She's in labor," Margaret announced, wide-eyed. Nathaniel didn't hesitate. He ran to Claire, found her breathless, clutching her side. "We're going to the hospital," he said firmly, taking her hand. The drive was tense. Nathaniel, usually so composed, couldn't hide the fear on his face. He held Claire's hands the entire way, whispering, "You're doing great. I'm right here. We've got this." At the hospital, the staff moved quickly, but Nathaniel never let go of her hand. Through every contraction, every hour, every cry, he was there, and then the sound of a baby's first breath filled the room. A tiny boy was placed in his arms. Nathaniel looked down at the child, his son, and felt his heart overflow. "He's perfect," he whispered, voice thick with emotion. Claire, exhausted but radiant, smiled through her tears. "He's everything." It was a moment neither of them would ever forget, a beginning. A promise. A few days later, Claire sat in bed, cradling their newborn son. The room was quiet, sun spilling through the curtains, soft and golden. Nathaniel entered, holding an envelope. He sat beside her, his eyes gentle but intent. "Claire," he said, "I want you to know something." He opened the envelope and began tearing the pages inside the contract into small pieces, letting them fall softly to the floor. "This doesn't matter anymore," he said. "Not when I have you. Not when we have each other." He took her hand in his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Everything I've done, every change, every choice, it's been for you, for Ethan, for our family. I don't want a piece of paper to define our future." Then, from his pocket, he pulled out a small velvet box. Inside, a ring sparkled softly in the light, elegant, timeless. "Claire Monroe," he said, lowering to one knee beside the bed, "you've brought light into my life. You've taught me what love is, what it means to have a family. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" Claire's hand flew to her mouth, tears spilling freely. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Nathaniel, I will." At that moment, Ethan, who had been quietly watching from the hallway, ran in with a burst of excitement. "We're going to be a real family," he shouted, throwing his arms around both of them. Nathaniel scooped him up and held him close, one arm around Claire, the other around the little boy, who had brought so much joy into his world. And just like that, a new chapter began, not one written by obligation or legacy, but by love. And together, they celebrated a moment that marked not just the start of a new chapter, but the beginning of a life they never dared to dream before. The months leading up to the wedding were filled with joy, gentle chaos, and quiet, meaningful preparation. Claire envisioned a ceremony that honored her roots, the strength, the simplicity, the love that had carried her through. Nathaniel made sure every detail reflected that dream. Cross Estate transformed into something out of a fairy tale. Lanterns glowed like stars in the garden. Fresh flowers danced in the breeze. Delicate lights wove between trees like golden threads. It was a perfect blend of tradition and new beginnings, a union not only of people, but of past and future. When the big day arrived, the sun shone gently over the garden. Claire, radiant in a white dress with soft golden embroidery, walked down the aisle with quiet grace. Ethan, beaming in his little suit, carried the rings with pride and excitement. As Claire reached him, Nathaniel's eyes glistened. "You look breathtaking," he whispered, taking her hands as if he never wanted to let them go. Their vows were simple, no grand poetry, just truth. They promised to love without conditions, to respect, to forgive, to grow, to choose each other every single day. They sealed their promises with a kiss, as heartfelt applause rose from their family and friends. The reception was a celebration of stories, cultures, and healing. Traditional music blended with melodies from Claire's childhood. Laughter echoed through the halls. The scent of warm bread, spices, and blooming roses filled the evening air. Ethan ran in joyful circles, thrilled by his new baby brother and the family that now surrounded him. Claire leaned against Nathaniel, her eyes reflecting the light of the garden lanterns. "This is everything I ever hoped for," she whispered. "And it's only the beginning," he replied, gently lacing his fingers with hers. As night fell, and the stars blinked awake above them, they danced beneath the open sky. No stage, no spotlight, just two hearts moving in quiet rhythm, surrounded by love, by laughter, by people who had witnessed the transformation of not just a couple, but a family. What began as an unexpected arrangement had become something beautiful, something lasting. Nearby, Ethan giggled as he played with his baby brother, the sound carrying softly through the night. Claire and Nathaniel exchanged a glance, no words needed. In that look was a promise. We will face whatever comes, together. They didn't know what the future held, but they knew what they held in their hands now: love, trust, and a home. And so, beneath the quiet stars of the American sky, their story didn't just end. It simply began again, a new beginning, filled with hope, healing, and light. How did this story touch you? Do you believe Claire made the right choice? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this journey moved your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and explore more healing stories right here. Let love guide your path, and never underestimate the power of second chances. Thank you, from the bottom of our hearts, for being here. Whether you've been with us from the beginning or just discovered our stories, your presence means the world to us. Every view, every comment, every moment you spend listening is a reminder that stories have the power to connect, to heal, and to bring light to even the quietest corners of our hearts. We hope this journey touched something deep within you and reminded you that love, hope, and second chances are always possible. Stay with us for more stories that inspire, uplift, and embrace the beauty of being human. With love, the Shining Stories team.